you could make a difference in people's lives.
How do you maintain quality and consistency across the firm when each partner has that level of autonomy?
That distinction between what they charge and what we charge is not a discount.
You don't want to be a discounted law firm or boutique law firm.
If you're not happy, if you can't wake up in the morning and look at yourself in the mirror saying, I'm excited about what I do, I'm excited to go to work, that's a problem.
Welcome to the podcast From Cold to Close. My name is Saeed and I'm the founder here at SRC Growth Partner, a growth company that works with professional services firms from around the world to help them increase their revenue and profitability by acquiring new clients. My guest today is Juan Zuniga, Managing Partner of Rimon, a tech-enabled, highly selective global law firm that spans over 50 offices in 11 countries and 5 continents. Juan is an international transactions attorney who has worked on cross-border deals throughout the United States, Latin America, and in over 60 other countries, and his practice specializes in transaction in real estate, resort and hospitality, mergers and acquisitions, and much, much more. Juan, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Saeed. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, no, I'm really excited for this conversation just because I've spoken to you before and you're a great personality. So I'm sure the viewers and listeners will love this one. But I guess the best place I want to start off with, and I do this with every single podcast, is I want to get a little bit, give the viewers and listeners an opportunity to get a flavor of your origin story, right? Your journey to where you are today and where you are within the organization and a little bit more about your role in the organization. So can you give us a little bit of an intro onto who you are and what you do at Rimon?
I would be pleased to, and I'd say that I'm particularly blessed, Saeed, because my personal origin, my family origin is part US and part Mexico. And I was raised in both countries, although I did all of my schooling, all of my education in the United States from primary school all the way through college and law school. Yet I had very deep roots across the border in Mexico, and I would spend significant parts of my childhood there. As I developed into adulthood and professional life, one of the turning points for me particularly was, like a lot of people in their early mid-20s, I was kind of drifting. I didn't really know what I wanted to do. And I worked for a couple of months with my father. And he was a small business accountant and bookkeeper. And he attended to the local, what we would call in the US, Hispanic or Latino community in his neighborhood in Los Angeles. And he was kind of a fixer, as they say. People would come to him with problems and he would always fix them, whatever they were. Help me with, getting an insurance policy, help me with my taxes, help me get my social security card, whatever it was, he'd go figure it out. He was born in Mexico and he immigrated to the United States in around the 90s. And so by the time I was working with him in the mid 1980s, he was well known in his community. And it was a particularly interesting year in that in the United States at the time, it was the tail end of the implementation of the last major Immigration Reform Act. It was called the Immigration Reform and Control Act of, I believe it was 1986. And so I was working with my dad in 1987. Maybe it was 1988. I don't remember precisely. But the notion was that there was essentially what we called at the time an amnesty program. And what that meant was that if you'd been in the United States as an undocumented immigrant for a significant period of time, and you could prove that you were essentially a person of good character, a good citizen, by paying taxes, by not being delinquent, you would be granted an amnesty for immigration violations and allowed a path to residency. And this created a flood of interest in the community where my father worked. And people would come in and they'd knock on the door. We were there to do people's income taxes, to report their local tax filings. And they'd come in knocking on the door and they'd say, can you help me with my papers, my immigration papers? And my dad, being who my dad was, he says, let me take a look. And I'm sitting there with him, watching him with fascination, how he was able to unravel the application system and help make a material difference in people's lives. And remember, this guy's not even a lawyer. He's just a self-taught business accountant. And we started processing immigration applications for people in that season before the deadline passed. And we, maybe filed 100 or 200 applications. Can you imagine just two guys in a small little office, no bigger than my kitchen, doing this and transforming people's lives? And that kind of lit a light bulb for me which is what was my incentive to go to law school, was with intelligence, with application, with care for your community, you could make a difference in people's lives. So I go off and I apply to law school, and I went into large law firms, the kind of law firms that now we call AmLaw 100, AmLaw 50 firms, the largest law firms in the United States. And I eventually built a practice, which is where I said before I felt blessed. I was able to build a practice where I was continuing to be a bridge between my US and my Mexican personalities. And maybe this resonates with you, Saeed. Maybe it resonates with a lot of your listeners who might be brought up in more than one cultural environment. It's kind of like you can have one personality in one and one personality in another. Your language, your mannerisms, things change. And to be able to be fluid and fluent in both cultures, for me, was a value add for my clients, if you will. So if I'm taking a US client that wants to invest in Mexican real estate and do a joint venture with a local developer, who's going to be the bridge? And it's not merely a legal bridge, it's not merely a linguistic bridge, it's a cultural bridge. And I do the same thing for Mexican and Latin American investors that want to come into the United States. And it's not merely linguistic fluidity, it is being able to translate concepts and notions from cultural notions to complex tax issues so that they can understand it and they can harmonize it within the environment from which they're coming from. So that's a bit about my practice, or how sort of my origin story more precisely. My practice then led me to starting up a solo independent law firm, a boutique law firm that at the time I called Cross Border Law Group. The notion being we're taking investment and we're crossing borders. And I wanted to be a branded concept. I didn't want to be, Juan Zuniga and Associates. I wanted to be a concept that would be useful to market. When people would see it, they'd get it. A light bulb goes off in your head. And it also correlates to particular value add that I bring to the situation. So then, having said that, I did that after 5 years. I'd been 15 years in some of the largest law firms in the United States, was not satisfied with that environment, started on my own, and then after 5 years of being on my own, and for what it's worth, those 5 years started in 2007, which was just on the cusp of a major financial crisis, as you and your listeners will recall, and I was able to survive and thrive in that very, very difficult moment. But as we were starting to emerge from the crisis, the landscape had changed for business, for real estate, for access to capital, and for my business, professional legal services. And I was looking around for a new alternative, and I found Rimon. And one of the things that I loved about Rimon was that it allowed me to keep the autonomy, the control over the relationship between me and my client, both as a personal relationship and as an economic bargain. In other words, Rimon allows me and my law partners to establish our rates directly with our clients without management interference, which is very unlike what happens at what we call big law. So that was very attractive to me, plus the value add that instead of me alone, plus my associate, 2 lawyers trying to make a living, we were now going to be in part of a larger environment in which there was going to be a lot of collaboration. And so this is around 2000. So you started your introduction with the firm about being technology enabled. And what that means essentially, at the time at least, was that we were leveraging the cloud. And by leveraging the cloud, we didn't have to be geographically centered in any location. Most law firms will say, hey, me and my 3 partners, we're going to open an office in London or Chicago or Los Angeles. And maybe you grow to have 2 offices in your region, right? Or maybe in the city next door. But you don't immediately go into the next jurisdiction. You don't go to the next state. You don't go to the next country. And at Rimon, we had, because of our technology leverage cloud-based platform, the ability to accept lawyers into our community from anywhere. So I opened the office in San Diego, and the office is, within air quotes, a virtual office. And we grew very nicely, and then the pandemic comes along. And what was interesting about the pandemic in this particular context was most lawyers and most traditional law firms say, no, you have to come to the office every day, right? The office is part of the milieu, as you would, for what it means to practice law. And now all of those large law firms were faced with the stunning reality overnight of having to try and work remotely. Right? Had we not had technology platforms like what we're talking on today, could you imagine how law office would have stayed alive, how they would have functioned in that period. So what happened for us was we were 8-10 years ahead of the curve. We were already working remotely. Many lawyers who were afraid or intimidated of our platform now started to have to work remotely within their organization, and they look around and they see Rimon as a viable alternative. And so when I joined Rimon in 2013, we were less than 35 lawyers. Today, we're over 200. So we've had a very, very accelerated growth curve, and a lot of it having to do with the fact that we were very ahead of the curve when it came to working remotely. So that's enough of a ramble. That's where I'll finish.
I think you touched on some really interesting points in that. And one of the things I wanted to talk to you about was the business model, right? And you mentioned there with partners individually being able to have pricing control over their relationships with their clients, which is it's not akin to the industry. You would typically see billable hours, you would typically see standard rates, so in your terms, with whether it's hourly rates, flat fees, contingency, or success fees, how do you maintain quality and consistency across the firm when each partner has that level of autonomy? Or is that the competitive advantage that you're talking about?
It is very much a competitive advantage to the extent that we are pitching our services to clients, and our competition set is the traditional law firm with very high billable rates, right? Because we do not carry the significant overhead going back to office leases, being in the office and real estate, we can drive our prices lower. When I'm on the recruiting front, I am always looking for lawyers with very high quality, excellent lawyers who do top level service and who have excellent clients as well. So I'm always on the front end doing a screening to making sure that the quality of the service in the door is always going to be at the highest level. And then we break down from there and we say, we'll now allow you to drive a better value bargain for your clients, because you don't have to pay for all of the overhead that you had to pay your traditional law firm. You can choose, as the individual partner in relationship with your client, to bill by the hour, to do flat fees, to do contingency, to do success fees, to do blended rates, to do all the kinds of things that make sense between you and your client. I'm also trusting in you, Saeed, as my law partner, that you're self-motivated to make money. You're not going to undersell your services, but I'm not going to tell you the rate at which you need to bill your services, because then I'm interfering in the relationship between you and your client. And this might be a client that you've had for 20 years or however long, right? And as the legal industry, especially at the highest tier, is pushing rates, billing rates, hourly billing rates, higher and higher and higher, certain legal practices are suffering because there is rate sensitivity depending on the nature of the services that are being offered. So private equity, bet the bank litigation, multi-billion-dollar M&A, you can always drive the highest rates there. But there's significant other practices that are much more rate sensitive. And there are lawyers who are feeling pressured and essentially squeezed out of the large law firm model. And we're a tremendous landing place for them. And so that's part of the value. Now, I'm going to be totally transparent with you. I do ask my lawyers to hit a certain revenue target, okay? Mm-hmm. But how they get there is their business.
Sure.
And then the other thing that I would say in addition to that is I want my partners to always understand that when we are talking about the rate differential between us and our services and the most expensive law firms and their services, which I will argue are very, very compatible in level of the quality of services. But what I want to emphasize is that that distinction between what they charge and what we charge is not a discount. It's a value-driven proposition. So I do not want to ever be defined as a discount law firm or discount lawyers. We're value-driven. We want to give better value to the clients, and hopefully the clients can see the transparency of that and it makes it that much easier to be able to land new clients and new engagements in whatever area.
Yeah, I absolutely love everything you said there. And I think it's really interesting, your approach to this kind of business model. But I want to talk to you about, obviously, when you're bringing in these partners into the organization, there has to be a level of trust there, as you mentioned, and obviously you set your targets and you set your expectations. But from what I'm hearing, you really need to be recruiting leaders, right? To self-motivated leaders who take responsibility in their own actions, in their own income, in their own abilities. And so how are you currently doing that? How are you recruiting great talent? How are you attracting that top talent? Are they coming to you, or are you going out to them? How do you define who's a good partner and who isn't?
Yeah, it's coming to us from a variety of sources. And of the qualities that I might add to your list, I would also add people who have an entrepreneurial mindset.
Yeah.
Many lawyers in our profession tends to be very tradition bound. And the lawyers who are feeling bound, to use the same word, by the bureaucracy and the politics and the systems of big law and are frustrated by the shackles that that imposes on them are often very well suited for our environment because they want to be able to be in charge of their own career, their own client development, their own compensation for that matter. And so there are a lot of factors in the big law community that many aspects of the humanity of practicing law, if I could put it that way. And there are lawyers who are very frustrated by that. There are some lawyers who are like, yeah, I just put my head down and I'm going to do my work and I draw my paycheck and that's it. But there are others who are not satisfied and are looking for a better way. So how do we recruit? We recruit from a variety of different sources. We use, more often than not, outside legal recruiters, headhunters, if you will, with whom we share particular goals and targets that we are looking to acquire as talent. Maybe it's a privacy lawyer, maybe it's an M&A lawyer located in Los Angeles specifically, maybe it's opening a new office in a city like Atlanta, something like that, right? We'll give them particular metrics and they will bring and screen talent to us. We have an internal referral program where our own partners are incentivized to bring to us and introduce to us lawyers, colleagues, opposing counsel with whom they might have been impressed to interview with us and consider joining us. And then, after 15 years, Saeed, and the growth and excellent reputation that we've had, people are finding us. I have had excellent lawyers from around the world send me blind emails. I mean, blind because I don't know this person. They just found me on LinkedIn. They researched Rimon on the internet and they say, hey, I'm a lawyer in this particular field of law, in this geography. I've heard about Rimon. I'd very much like to talk to you. And we have had some tremendous additions, essentially through people finding us, including our most recent growth in London, in the UK, in 2024. That group did their research and they found us and they came over as a practice group of about 10 lawyers. So that's one of the things that I'm aspiring to in, say, the next 5 years is kind of redefining what the legal marketplace and the legal industry thinks of us as a law firm. If you take our origin story of being, technology enabled, technology leveraged, remote, distributed, etc. That's a great origin story. But we are now at a moment of inflection, I would argue, where we're 200 lawyers and our reputation and our ability to deliver a full service package to our clients is now at a point where what we want to do is we want to change the definition of what the industry thinks who we are. Instead of saying, oh, you're that cute little practice, but you're not a true law firm, and instead move into the area of being defined as a true go-to law firm with solid practices and the ability to attract clients, but again, driving a better value, not a discount, driving a value. So we're in an inflection moment where we've got to redefine or have the community redefine who we are to think of us as a true solid law firm, which is what we think of ourselves internally. Sometimes you need to change the mindset of other people around you.
It's about, I guess, positioning yourself in the market so that others can see you in the way that you need or you are, right? And it might not be commonplace or common knowledge, right? You talk a lot about the value-driven approach that you have, right? And you don't want to be a discounted law firm or boutique law firm. You're very well driven on the value side. How do you, I guess, train the team, the partners to have that approach at all times? Because when you're bringing in partners and things like that, it's very easy to go, if I've got a target here that I need to get, okay, let me just get a few clients in. They might be cheaper, but I got them in, rather than going for ensuring the close, as opposed to going out and going, no, less of more, right? Or more value driven approaches. So how do you do that? How do you manage that as a leader in the business?
So, Said, I think that's such an excellent question. And I believe that to accomplish that, we need to sort of delve into psychology as much as anything. And I will answer that in part with an anecdote, with a story. When I first joined Rimon from Cross Border Law Group, I kept my billing rates the same. Under our model at Rimon, when I lend my services to one of my partner has the discretion to increase the billing rate that I charge to my partner, because they know, again, the value proposition that their clients are willing to pay. So under our model, I will charge a discounted internal rate to my partner to service my partner's clients. So just by way of example, in this one particular instance, I was working for one of my partners, Scott Ross, and he asked me to look at the invoice, the pre-bill, before he sent it to the client. And everything was fine, my time entries were correct. But I sent a note over to Scott and I said, hey, Scott, you're billing me out this was 2013, you're billing me out at $500 an hour. I billed myself out at $450. And he said, don't worry, you're worth it. And I had to pause for a second when I got that. Going to the manner in which you were asking the question is, I'm desperate to get that client in the door. Maybe I'll discount my rate even further to get them in the door. What Scott planted in my head was, well, no, we're high value, we're high quality. We don't need to make that kind of concession. Because more often than not, that client who wants to try and discount us even more is going to want to then argue about the bill because they're not happy, because they're thinking you're not giving value. So it becomes a psychological sort of internal question for yourself is, do you value yourself as much as your partners value you, as much as your clients value you? And if you can make that internal shift and say, I'm willing to price my services for what they are really worth, as opposed to I feel the insecurity of having to discount even more, right? That's the kind of shift. And the second anecdote is maybe a couple of months after that, I had a new client prospect find me, and he asked me what my billing rate was. And my billing rate is X, whatever, $500 an hour. And he said, well, do you have any referrals? Who else have you worked for? And I gave him a list of my clients. And I said, if you want to call any of them, they'll tell you, that I do really good work for them. And he said to me, well, I'm not as rich as those guys, so why don't you charge me less than you would charge them? And I had to pause for a second, and I reflected back both on what Scott said to me, A, you're worth it, and B, on the notion, well, if my client of 15 years finds that I'm charging some other dude less for the exact same work, that puts me out of integrity with my client. So I said to the guy, you know what? I don't think I'm the lawyer for you. End of conversation. And I think to be able to appreciate what you're worth is as much as an internal emotional and psychological exercise. And if I can find the lawyer who understands that the overvaluation of the services at big law can be tempered in our environment, and then that lawyer can also say, I am still an excellent, high value, high quality professional service advisor, and I'm worth what I'm going to charge you. That's the magic, right? That's where the formula is.
Absolutely. I think it's a psychological play, isn't it? Because if you know, or if you feel worthy, then you're more willing to go, no, you stand your ground. You go, no, it's fine. I'll find someone else who's willing to pay. I'd much rather someone that knows my worth, is willing to pay my worth, than someone that wants to discount what they think I'm worth, right? It's a really interesting point you mentioned there, because it's a psychology of how you look at yourself, value what you do, but also understanding the value you have to other people, right? And actually the impact you can have in the good work you can do. Because there's lots of cowboys out there, there's lots of less than great lawyers out there who will take advantage, who will take that discount. And just by showing that level of integrity, you will naturally leave an impression on that individual. Whether if he makes a little bit more in a few years' time, he might come back going, oh, you know what, Juan, that time that he must know what he's talking about because he didn't budge. I might come back to you. If he doesn't, he doesn't. But it's a real interesting position in that sense. In terms of, I guess you've been in the business for many years now. For lawyers who are feeling trapped, I guess, by the traditional big law model, and as you mentioned there, that are going about their days and just accepting what the model is, what advice would you give them about an alternative career path?
Oh boy, that's a pretty loaded question because there's lots of different ways you could go with that. I would submit starting with the following question, which is, are you happy with what you do? A lot of lawyers, this resonates with me, at least in the United States. A lot of younger lawyers come out with very, very heavy educational debt. And so they feel trapped to earn top dollar by working at the biggest law firms and then have very unsatisfying careers, are overworked, and there is a lot of obfuscation in how the organization that you're working with really functions and what your future is there. Your future is always opaque at big law. You're never sure whether you're going to be promoted from associate level 3 to associate level 4. Are you going to make it to non-equity partner? Are you going to make it to equity partner? More and more non-equity partner tiers are being created all the time, which to me sounds even worse. If you're not happy, if you can't wake up in the morning and look at yourself in the mirror saying, I'm excited about what I do, I'm excited to go to work, that's a problem. And I think you need to fundamentally deal with that question. And when I woke up one morning and said I wasn't happy, I decided that I didn't necessarily want to just jump out of the frying pan and into the fire, go from one law firm that was the same profile to the other one. I needed to radically expand what I wanted to do to solve for my personal happiness, to make sure that my professional life was giving me as much satisfaction as it could. Because if it's not, then what the hell are you doing? And the legal profession can give tremendous amount of satisfaction. Going again back to psychology, one of the things that I think we do as lawyers is we take other people's problems and we put them on our backs and we carry them for a while, and hopefully when we're done, we unload them and there's a solution at the end of the day. There's a tremendous psychological satisfaction, for me at least as a lawyer, to get my client's transaction closed, to get the money paid, to transfer the deed of title, to close the loan, whatever it is. That's a success. And having success in your profession is really important for your own personal satisfaction. So if you're not happy when you wake up in the morning, take some radical thought and figure out what it is you need to do to be happy in this profession. And it may mean leaving big law completely and going to a boutique practice. It might be changing from litigation to transactional law, which is what I did when I was a third-year associate. It might mean any number of things, but you've got to really address the fact that you're not happy, that you're feeling trapped. Now, if you're a mid-level partner with a book of business of around $1 million, $1.5 million, and you're feeling like you're a third-class citizen in your law firm, I've got the solution for you. Call me, because I will find that happiness for you, all right? That's the particular profile that I'm looking for. But there's lots of different profiles in between, and I just submit, if you're not happy, you've got to solve for that before you solve for anything else. Maybe you've got to solve for that in the context of a very challenging financial situation, given that you might have to pay back law school loans, but that's a math problem. And with very good advisors, you can solve math problems. It may take time, it may take discipline, but you can solve for the math problems. I wouldn't let those be intimidating factors.
I think that's some really great advice there. In this segment of the podcast, Juan, we like to call the Entrepreneur's Room. And that's a series of questions we like to ask all of our guests to give our viewers and listeners an opportunity to understand how business owners, business leaders think and operate in their business. So the first question I like to ask at this stage of the podcast is, how are you currently spending your days as a leader of the business?
Well, unfortunately, I spend too much of my time, as they say in business school, in the business than on the business, right? I have in my mind a strategic plan for growth that addresses some of the issues that we've talked about before. Rebranding, re-reputationizing, if that's a word, who we are in the legal industry. I know that's not a word, I made it up. But unfortunately, I have to spend a lot of time just sort of in the day-to-day grind. Part of why I have to do that is because if you go back to our origin story, we're sort of the law firm equivalent of a startup company, right? And any startup company, when it gets too big, the processes that you used to use when you were smaller may no longer serve you. They get stretched, they get stressed, they break. And so you need to then recalibrate, reorganize, adjust the way you do things. Some people would criticize it because now you have to put in more policy and process. You have to be more formal than informal. And so for right now, I am spending a lot of time in that internal transition process, which is challenging and difficult, and it was not what I thought I would be doing when I took on this position. More time in that than in the big picture strategy, recruiting, branding, doing these kind of things, public relations, etc. Because what I need to do, and I'm the best person suited for it, and one of my better traits is to evangelize my company, right? To let people know who we are, to be in constant sell mode. So that's the problem with my day-to-day is I'm spending too much in the internal transformation process as we grow. And then what I'm hoping, at least, Saeed, in all candor, is I can sort of get through some of that internal processes in this 2025 so that in 2026 I can start pivoting more to the bigger strategic focus that I'd like to be spending most of my time on. That may be fantasy. I suspect it'll be more gradual. It's not like I flip a switch on January 1st, 2026 and all of a sudden my day-to-day changes. But I hope that it will proceed in that direction.
Absolutely love that. And I love that you started off your response in saying that you work a lot more in the business than on the business, and it's that self-awareness that's the key point, right? Because once you know that that's the case, then you can go, okay, well, I'm doing this, but I know what I'm striving to move towards. So I think it's a really interesting response there. In terms of then, as a leader of the business, and you mentioned earlier as well, like you have targets for your partners and things like that. What are the most important metrics for you when running the business?
Well, are you talking about running the business or when growing and recruiting? Because when running the business, the most important metrics are like any leader, right? Running the business means you've got to be able to think about your growth plan on the one hand, deal with the day-to-day fires. I call some of my internal leaders the firefighting team, right? Some conflagration comes up because a wire transfer gets blocked because it needs to be sent to some country that may be on a sanctions list. How do we deal with that? And all of a sudden you're spending 3 hours on that. And then always managing your relationships with your partners. The engine of my firm are my lawyers, my law partners, and I was once one of them. I've been at this firm for 11 years now, 12 years next month. And so I try and keep as much as I can a open line of communication with my partners to see what's working and what's not working for them. Are they happy, celebrating their successes? Are they having frustrations? How can I help you with that? So I traded in my stable of external clients for my partners being my internal stable of 200 clients. And, I've got to make sure that they're happy, that things are running smoothly for them, that I hear their concerns. And that takes a lot of time. That's a very high intensity, emotionally engaging task that I have. When we're talking about growth, I also like to do interviews with most of our partner targets that are interested in joining our firm. And I'm always assessing primarily three things. One, human character, right? Are you just a good person? I don't want people with sharp elbows who are, scrapping for every last dollar on the table and creating antagonistic relationships with your partners. No, you need to be able to be community-minded and community-oriented. Two, are you an excellent lawyer? What is your field of expertise? What's your value add? Do your clients appreciate you? Does that field of expertise sit harmoniously with who our identity is as a law firm? Because there might be instances in which there could be philosophical or reputational conflicts that might prevent you essentially from fitting well into our community. I'll give you a hypothetical. It's not applicable to us, but a hypothetical is, some law firms in the life sciences space will represent big pharma and others will represent generic pharmaceutical companies, right? And you kind of decide to choose a line. So I'm not going to interview a big pharma lawyer if I'm a generic law firm, right? So I have to make those kind of assessments. And then the third is back to economics, right? I have to underwrite essentially your portable book of business, which I'd like to be around $750,000 that you originate, and I want to see that that portable book of business is going to be transferable into our firm. There are some instances where it is, and there's some where it's not. Quite frankly, you're like, oh, you're coming from big law. That's a big law firm client. That's not your client. So in other instances, this is great. You've got a $2 million book of business, but 90% of that is one client. What happens when that client gets acquired? What happens when the general counsel retires? What happens when the CEO retires? Where's your book of business, right? So I've got to take into account a lot of different economic factors when we underwrite someone's practice before bringing them in.
It's such an interesting role, especially when you're dealing with 200 partners. There's a huge responsibility there on your shoulders that you're having to manage, and it must be a challenge in itself, a thing that takes most of your time for sure. In terms of growing the business, and you mentioned that you have a strategy that you're thinking about at the moment for 2026. In terms of actually growing the business, how are you currently growing the business? What kind of business development activities are you doing to give growth the best opportunity?
Yeah, okay, so I've been spending a lot of time thinking about that, Saeed. My internal thesis that I'm trying to validate through extrapolating data from our financial system, and I'm hoping that my thesis is not merely anecdotal experience, but will be backed up by the data. But that thesis is our economic model is more naturally accretive with certain types of lawyers and certain types of law practices. Right. And if you can prove that out, then what you want to do is you want to grow primarily in those areas, because I can bring you over as an M&A lawyer, mergers and acquisitions lawyer, for example, and have a fairly solid understanding that I can increase your book of business and your personal compensation by 20% by bringing you over to Rimon. And again, if you go back to our internal market model that I was sharing with you and the anecdote that I gave you about my partner, Scott Ross, saying, hey, you're worth it. Scott is creating value to the firm by sending legal services for his clients to lawyers in other practice areas that he doesn't service. So Scott is an estate planning lawyer, and he sends work to me as a real estate lawyer, and maybe he sends work to a litigator, and maybe he sends work to an employment lawyer, et cetera, et cetera. So his practice is throwing off work throughout my community. So that's what I mean by accretive. Are there particular practices that I can attract and say, not only will you be very happy coming to Rimon, because I'll pay you more than what you're making at your current law firm, but in addition to that, there is a potential contingent bonus that you could earn if you produce more work for others in our community. So if I validate those practice areas with financial data, then those are the targets that I want to go for first and foremost. Then, to be a full service law firm, you need to have the other practices that support those practices that throw off of the work. So I'm a real estate lawyer myself personally, so I sometimes throw off work to other people, but it's not the most important value that I add. So I would put real estate maybe at a tier beneath the ones that are throwing off the most work, but I still need real estate lawyers, right? Because an M&A company or a company that's being acquired in an M&A transaction or a company that's gotten new financing needs real estate support services, right? So we need to build out the second layer as well, which is what I'd call, the basics, the bread and butter of any law firm. Litigators, real estate lawyers, tax, employment lawyers, etc. And then underneath that, well, I wouldn't say underneath that, that's not appropriate because that sounds derogatory. But as part of the equation, and an important part of the equation, is you also need specialty practices, right? And in the current environment, you need privacy and AI. There are sanctions lawyers. There are trade lawyers. There are government contracts lawyers. There are lawyers that have very unique specializations that you need to have in the mix as well. Whether or not they come over with their own independent book of business is something that I will try and solve for at the end of the day. But you need those additional areas of support are even further value added to the firm environment and to our clients, right? Because one thing is, sure, everyone's got litigators, but how many people have that import lawyer named Sandra Bell today who is reading every tariff move that Trump is doing on a daily basis, right? Her phone is exploding off the hook. So to have her as a resource in my community is a tremendous value add in the current environment. Yesterday, we got an email that said, oh my gosh, we have all these European clients who are concerned about immigration law in the United States, both for their personal purposes and for their company purposes. Sonia, go call Sonia Oliveira. She's our immigration law expert, right? So when I've got those subject matter experts, those specialization expertises, I've got extra value. So as I build, I'm building multiple layers of the cake, if you will. Again, focus towards what works best with our economic model. And with that, entrepreneurially minded lawyer, independent, value added, appreciates themselves, their internal psychological value to their clients and their community. And hopefully without ego. Well, without too much ego.
A lot of the time, entrepreneurial people have an element of ego, so you don't want to. You have to have a level of ego to be able to feel, back yourself to the point where you go, no, I can do it. But you don't want it to overwhelm someone where it's like, okay, that it becomes debilitating or it holds you back, right?
I'd say ego and arrogance can be very useful tools in the emotional toolkit, so long as they're in balance.
Yes,
right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Couldn't agree with you more. Juan, it's been an absolute pleasure speaking with you today. I like to end every single podcast on the same question. And it is, if you had a magic wand you could wave to solve one business problem, what would that be?
If I had a magic wand that I could solve one business problem, and you mean, I'm assuming, directly related to my business. I never thought of that before, and I'm struggling a bit because I don't know what one thing I would want more than anything else. Maybe, to be honest, I would want a mini-me. Remember the Austin Powers movie, right? I would want someone who I could have side by side that I could delegate important projects to that get pushed into the background because I'm a day-to-day firefighter spending too much time in the business, who would have intelligence, discretion, discipline, and authority to take them to conclusion. And if I had a true partner in that sense, I think I would be very happy. I think probably my greatest struggle at this point is being like the sole CEO. That's really hard, to be honest, and in a lot of ways, to be the only person who has discretion. Most companies have boards of directors or have, various layers of management. Ours is a very thin and narrow organizational structure with me on the top. And I would like to be able to share some of that with someone that I truly trust and respect.
I absolutely love that response, and it really leans into that, having a good leadership team, having a good team that you can just delegate so you can strategize, so you can work on the business rather than in the business, and having those. So it really leans into your thought process and where you are at the moment. So I think that's really great. Yeah. Juan.
And like I said before, we were going into this notion of if I can get out of this transitional period, then maybe I can get to there in 2026 or 2027. But here I am, the plane takes off, you got to strap on your seatbelt. So.
Absolutely. Well, Juan, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on the podcast. Thank you so much for sharing your time, sharing your insights, and having a great conversation. For all our viewers and listeners, if they ever wanted to reach out to you, where would they find you?
You can find me easily on LinkedIn or our law firm on the internet. Our law firm is Rimon Law, RIMONLAW.com. I'm on LinkedIn. You can send me a note there. Sometimes I take a time to respond. Send me a friend invitation. If you'd like to set up a dialogue just to chat. I love chatting about the business. I feel very passionate about who we are and what we do. I'm always open to share ideas. Saeed, I want to thank you particularly. Again, you guys found me, I think, on LinkedIn. So thank you for the invitation. This has been absolutely delightful. I want to wish you the greatest success in your endeavor and in this podcast. I can't wait to see our recording.
Yeah, no, really appreciate it. And I'll put all the links in the description so everyone can find it very easily. But you've been a great guest, Juan. Thank you very much for your time today.
All right.
You
take care.
Bye now.
Ciao.